Okay, hi everyone. Today we have Michael Westthorp from our university, Middlesex University, and he's gonna. It's a good change from we had quite a few e-learning webinars the past couple of weeks, so it's quite useful to take a different approach and consider climate change in terms of the environment that we are, the buildings. Reconsidering architecture with thinking of green buildings, the green side of architecture. Michael will introduce himself and what he does for Middlesex University and also outside. And hopefully we will have a very exciting session. This session is going to be recorded. And I hope Michael would be happy to receive any emails from those of you who will be seeing the recording in September when you're back from holiday. So without any further delay, Michael, floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, George, for that introduction. So my name is Michael Westthorp. I'm a senior lecturer at the Art and Creative Industries faculty at Middlesex University. I'm currently the module leader of the final year on the interior design program. I also run my own practice, which I've done for 20 years. So this talk is going to be about the built environment responses to climate change. Over the period of 20 years that I've been in practice, the way that we think about sustainability within the built environment has massively altered. And as our understanding of sustainable practice grows, so the industry responds to it. I will look at various strategies and ideas that are currently ongoing in our ideas about tackling climate change. So first of all, what is the built environment? Well, in this context, it's all man-made structures that go up to make our habitat. So for example, this is the South Bank in London, and we have the Festival Hall here, which is sort of a big piece of iconic architecture, and likewise the London Wheel, the London Eye, which is a structure, all part of the built environment, as is Waterloo Station and the train and the infrastructure around it, as are parks if they're man-made. It's basically every building that you come into contact with. And also, because my specialism is in interiors, this is the college building at Middlesex, it's also focusing on the interior world as well. Our recreation spaces and things that spill out onto streets, so as well as the interiors, the kind of the streetscape as well. That's the built environment. Now, how is our built environment contributing to the climate emergency? Well, in short, massively, absolutely predominantly. So together, building and construction are responsible for 39% of all carbon emissions in the world, with operational emissions from energy used to heat, cool, and light buildings accounting for 28%. The remaining 11% comes from embodied carbon emissions or upfront carbon that is associated with materials and construction processes throughout the whole building life cycle. So 28% of our carbon emissions are used to heat and cool our buildings and light our buildings, and 11% is in the construction of those buildings in the first place. This diagram looks at the usual life cycle of a building. Now, most people concentrate on this part, which is the use of the building, the biggest part really of a building's life. And as architects and designers, we are very interested in the construction part, this part here. But also before a building is constructed, there's the production of the materials that then go in to make the building. And each one of these stages has carbon emissions. So you can see that it already, before a building has even started to be inhabited, that large amounts of carbon emissions have taken place. And then when those buildings are in use, of course, there's repair, and there's refurbishment, and eventually a building would come to its end of use. Now, this can be a moment where it has stopped serving its original purpose, or it may be that land values in that particular area have become more expensive, and it's better for the landlord to knock it down and rebuild something else. And at the moment, currently, our land waste management isn't really what it should be. Buildings are knocked down and then they're put into landfill. We don't really recycle a lot of the materials that we use. And I think this is an opportunity for developers, when they employ architects and designers, to really put the forefront of sustainability into practice, to think about how buildings can be reused to give them other life. And at the moment, we have a preference for building with virgin materials, with materials that are new. And the most dominant of those is concrete, really still. Around 400 million tons of new materials are used in UK construction each year. In the UK, approximately 50,000 buildings are demolished each year, generating 45 million tons of construction and demolition waste. The majority of this is concrete, masonry, brick and steel. So 50,000 buildings in the UK alone are demolished every year, which is a kind of staggering amount to think about. Think of all that waste for the building stock. Now, sometimes this has to happen. Sometimes the building has served its purpose, or it's dilapidated, it's about to fall down. And the developer, the owner of the land, thinks, well, okay, this is my opportunity to now build something new or sell the land to build something new on it. But at this point, what I'm trying to argue in this lecture a little bit is that we need to be thinking twice about how we use that building stock, especially in built-up areas, where it would make economic sense to reuse the building in some way. And if a building can't be saved, if it has to be demolished because it makes financial sense, then perhaps a rethinking of how the building is dismantled. So, okay, I've got a raised hand, George.
Sorry, yeah, I was wondering, I mean, there aren't that many of us, so we may as well make it a little bit more interactive in terms, I had the question, do you think these numbers are gonna definitely going, I mean, obviously, this is 2019, and with COVID, maybe construction has been affected, but is the pattern going to, does it show that it's gonna increase dramatically?
Well, in the 50,000 buildings was in the news last month. It's a big strategy for the RBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, have just sort of got behind this figure in an opportunity to try and reverse the idea of what architects currently think, to stop architects predominantly knocking down and rebuilding, or developers rather than architects, because it's the developers that are paying the architects in the first place. So we are hoping that that figure will go down. It's partly because we haven't built a huge amount of buildings, especially social housing or housing, for quite some time, and so the rate of land clearance is quite high. So I do imagine it will go down, George. Yes, I do think so.
And also, the other thing that I wanted to ask is that, because I've been reading a lot in terms, it's in the news, how the creation of cement and building requires a huge amount of sand, which also has to be specific type of sand.
Yeah.
And therefore, that is another cultural, there's another climate impact of.
Absolutely, I'm just about to come on to that.
Sorry, I'm going to mute myself.
You'll see in a minute. We're just about to talk about concrete. All right, this is on my. I have a dog, and I walk the dog every morning, and I go past this building quite a lot. It's a block of flats, typical of blocks of flats built everywhere in the UK and around the world, certain climates, and its dominant material is concrete. Its main structure, it's reinforced concrete. It's steel inside concrete, and concrete is made up of aggregate, sand, and cement. So the cement industry, we're a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world, behind China and the US. This is from a report in 2018. It generates around 2.8 tons of CO2, equivalent to 8% of the global total. So concrete is a major problem, and you're right. All of the factors of it are a problem. All of the things in a mix, but the cement is the particular difficulty. So here's another block. You can see that the reason that we build in concrete is that it's tried and tested. It's incredibly strong. It's fireproof. It's relatively easy to build this way. It's safe for architects to build this way because all of the details are already kind of covered everywhere. We know what its properties are. It's very well tested. So to step outside of building with concrete takes effort. It takes a sort of a bit of a risk. Okay, countries all over the world are facing a housing crisis with massive shortage of homes for expanding populations. Around 1.6 billion people live in substandard housing and 100 million are homeless, according to United Nations statistics. So we can't not build. We have to build. And so what we are looking at is a situation where if we continue to build in concrete, we are damaging the environment. If we don't build, we are not housing people to the standards that we should be. So it's a difficult situation. All right, so I'm going to now just look through some of the strategies and thinking that are currently taking place within the industry. And I'm going to do these kind of relatively quickly. And obviously, if anybody has any questions, then please they can email me afterwards or ask a question. So the first one is insulation. Now, insulation is particularly unglamorous. It's the sort of boring part that people aren't interested in, but it has a fundamental impact on CO2 emissions. A poorly insulated home or other sort of building will require more heating. And in the summer, when it's hot, it'll require more cooling. So the insulation traps in the heat and the cold and makes the CO2 emissions fall. Things like windows, obviously, are thinner and therefore have less insulated properties. And of course, in the UK, we have a massive stock of Victorian buildings, which are mostly uninsulated. Now, we have taken some strides in this recently, in that there was the start of a retrofit rollout of buildings, of insulation firms that the government was sponsoring, and they've stopped that, and there is some call for that to be brought back. But of course, insulating your loft and your walls is one of the best things you can do to counteract carbon emissions. This is a typical sort of insulation that's being installed in many people's homes and lofts. There's a problem with this insulation as well, because it's damaging to the environment in its manufacture. And so lots of companies are working on alternatives to this type of rigid insulation. It's got great insulation properties, thermal insulation properties, but it is harmful. And one of the alternatives is this cork material. Now, cork is a renewable resource, and it's got great thermal properties. So there's lots of different alternatives in development at the moment. And I'll talk about another one of them later on. Okay, so another strategy that we're using is adaptive reuse and reversible design. I've put these two together, they're slightly different. Adaptive reuse refers to the process of reusing an existing building for a purpose other than which it was originally designed for. It's also a recycling or conversion of an existing building, we call it that. Adaptive reuse is a very effective strategy for optimizing operation and commercial performance of existing buildings. So interior design is at the heart of this, because interior design uses a host building to start off with. And reversible design is a way of thinking ahead when designing a building to think about how it might be adapted in the future, how it might be dismantled or how it might be altered so that it doesn't have to be knocked down. Approximately 60% of construction output is new build, while 40% is refurbishment and maintenance. So the balance is the wrong way for a sustainable future. That 60% of construction is new build, meaning that new materials are all being used to build those buildings. Whereas 40% is refurbishment and maintenance, which is using an existing building shell and building something new within it. So I'm going to talk about a project that I was involved with in 2007 it was. It's in Waterloo in South London. This is Waterloo Station and this is Waterloo Road. Now this map is from 1870 and it shows the buildings that I was designing here. It's three little buildings either side of a larger joinery works with a kind of building that attaches to the street for the joinery works. So when I took it over, the client wanted to make it into an Indian restaurant, and the Indian restaurant was called Bangalore Express. And the client approached the landlord and signed a lease, but the landlord would only sign a 5-year lease because this area was becoming gentrified. It was going through changes at the time, and land value was starting to go up. And the landlord had an overall idea that they would demolish this set of buildings. These buildings here would be demolished at a future date. And the 5-year lease gave the landlord enough time to put planning applications in and sort things out while still making some money for my Indian restaurant. And for the Indian restaurant client, they decided this was a good idea because it was a new venture for them. They weren't sure whether it would be successful, so 5 years seemed like a good idea. You can see this is a typical kind of London street in that this is a building from probably the, I don't know, probably 1800, maybe late 1900s. Sorry, yes, late 1900s.
None of them are listed though, right?
None of them are listed. None of them are listed. And then this building, this new building here was just 2 years old in 2007. It was a relatively new building. It was an office building, and that sort of typified what was happening in this area. That buildings were getting knocked down and being made into offices. This was offices above, and we were occupying the ground floor and basement, the restaurant. But you can see the little kind of higgledy-piggledy extension there that's been stuck onto the top of this building. And I would imagine that this looks like a 1950s thing, which might be due to war damage, to bombing during the war, and then infill put in the 1950s. So we designed a restaurant called Bangalore Express. This is an image of it, but it was designed to be demountable. We always had this idea that in 5 years' time, we were probably going to have to move, that the client was going to have to move. And so it's quite an expense to design a restaurant and make it. And so the client wanted to be able to salvage as much as possible to take to another site. So for example, these are scaffold poles, and they were easily demountable. All the fixings are exposed, all the screws and everything are exposed, so they're easily takeable away and moved to another site. All of the wall cladding with these kind of grooves cut into it are easily taken out. You have to take one panel off and then you can take all the rest of the panels out. So we designed it to be demountable. And that's exactly what happened. When 5 years came up and the landlord said, okay, the lease is now up for renewal. Actually, what happened was they didn't demolish the building. They put it up for a new lease. But the client had decided that they were going to move to the city. So a lot of this equipment, a lot of this interior fit out got moved to a new site in the square mile in the city of London. So what actually happened to the site was it stayed pretty much exactly the same, but Tesco bought the lease for 5 times the value of the Indian restaurant were paying, and now it's a Tesco. So this is my original fit out, and then this is exactly the same fit out, exactly the same position, but now a Tesco's. And so while I feel mixed feelings that this restaurant isn't my design anymore, it's not my restaurant that I designed anymore, I do slightly feel okay that it's been given another use, that the building has been reused. It was a restaurant and now it's a shop. So that's an idea of what adaptive reuse is. On a larger scale, this is South Africa, Cape Town, and this is a grain silo, which is going to be made into the Zeit Museum, which is a contemporary African art museum in South Africa. The usual form for this sort of building, for example, the Guggenheim building in Bilbao, which is in a similar site, was to knock down all the existing structure. But here the client employed Thomas Heatherwick, British designer, not actually an architect, a designer, to go at it in a different way. And you can see the condition of the building. It would be easier to knock this down. It would be easier to landfill all of this material. But what Heatherwick did, which I think is quite ingenious, he worked with the existing structure. And it's not promising. These grain silos are enormous concrete tubes. And so you kind of think, well, how would you use them? And so what he started to do is use them as circulation routes. This is a spiral staircase being lowered, craned into one of the grain silos. And he also did a really clever thing, I think. He excavated inside the grain silos, removing part of the structure. So this big scoop comes out of the silos, making this incredible abstract space. So all the grain silos are around it, but this is an atrium space which links all of the spaces of the gallery. And one of the things, the qualities of adaptive reuse is that you get the history of the building on display to the skill of the designer. So the designer here is incredibly skillful, incredibly very clever designer, and they have exposed the structure, the existing structure of the silos, but retained it and made it for practical use as an art gallery, as an atrium space. So you get a sense of the history of the building. It's not erasing what was there before, it's using it in a different way. I think it's quite remarkable, quite a remarkable building. I very much look forward to going to visit it at some point. This is a different example. This is sort of reversible design. This is the Europa building by Salmon and Partners in Belgium, in Brussels. It's effectively a large-scale addition to an existing building. There's a building here, and there's a little building, oh, it's not that little, but a smaller building here, historic building here. And the land in between was unused, it was parking. So what they've done is built a big rain screen on the outside, and they've used salvaged single glazed wooden frames. Now, single glazed wooden frames are one of the least thermal performance of any component in a building. You know, we now have double or triple glazed, and so single glazed windows were thrown away. And so here the designers used them as a rain screen and also as a sound baffle to bounce back the traffic noise, because there's a motorway right next to it. And so this is material that's been salvaged from other buildings, many buildings. It's obviously hundreds of window frames, and then added to this new building. And the building itself is quite a simple steel frame. All of that is steel, and therefore it's very easy to be demountable and taken away should they need to. And it's also very easy to add extra steel members onto to make new floors if it's required. So this bit of the building, this kind of bit on the outside, the inside-outside, is like a train station where people still wear their coats, and the insulated part of the building is this kind of, well, I guess it's like a vase-shaped part, which is where the offices are. So I think it's a really clever strategy of reuse and rethinking about how a building might be constructed. All right, another big area is in materials. Now, when I left college and started in practice in 1995, I worked for a company called Ben Kelly Design, and we were approached by a rep who had this idea of turning yogurt pots into a recycled material. And at the time we thought, wow, this is really quirky. And in '95, nobody thought about the use of plastic. I mean, it wasn't a consideration, apart from, you know, one or two people, I guess, and this guy was one of them. And we used it quite a lot because we really liked the product, not necessarily for its green credentials. We just thought it was a really quirky product. Now, this image is from Smile Plastic, who are a modern equivalent of this company made of waste from the 1990s. And Smile Plastic, they have a message about recycling yogurt pots to make new materials, which is great to an extent. So my kind of caveat with this is that the message about recycling becomes so positive that it becomes an incentive to consider that recyclable waste isn't really waste at all. So ideally, although it's very difficult to eat yogurt without a pot, ideally we'd be cutting down waste in the first place. We'd be trying to remove that. But there are loads and loads of products out there which are recycling various different types of leftover waste. I think this is a really interesting one. This is called Orb, and it's by a company called Bihome. Bihome are a really interesting company. I'll cover another one of the products in a second. But this is a sheet material equivalent to MDF or chipboard, something like that. It can be cut with a saw or a jigsaw or a circular saw. It can be routed. It has all the different, all the similar qualities to MDF, to other panel products, but it's made of food waste. So one of the wastes that we're never going to get rid of is food waste, and it's also 100% biodegradable. So it will just rot if it's put into landfill very quickly. So I think that's really kind of an interesting substitute. And also the same company, Bihome, are working on this stuff, which is called Mycelium. And it's a panel product, but they're developing it to be a type of insulation. And early tests on this show that it has equivalent thermal performance of all of the kind of the main manufacturers of insulation. And they've just bought a disused paper mill, which they're converting to make into a full-scale production of insulated panels, which I think is really interesting. And it's fungus, it's a grown product rather than something that's harvested. It's grown, so it's a never-ending supply of it, of a fungus byproduct. So I think that's really interesting in the world of recycling. But recycling only takes us so far, and it's used for fit out. It's not really used for main construction. However, there are other things. So, for example, this is cross-laminate timber. This is a company called Curto. This is from their website. And Curto made cross-laminate timber, which is essentially a wood laminate, a wood and then wood the other way, and then wood the other way, and then wood the other way, to make something that's very rigid. I'll show you a picture in a moment. And with Curto, what's kind of interesting about it, that you order it and they bring it to site already constructed. So it cuts out on a lot of material waste, which is another big problem with the construction industry. We waste so much. Yes, something around the estimate of between, depending on who you talk to, 150, something like 50 to 100 houses are built, and we waste one house due to the construction of them. So there's a huge amount of on-site waste happening, and Curto are trying to get rid of that. So components of buildings arrive fully assembled and are just inserted into an already existing frame. Now, this uses wood, and I think wood is one of those materials that we need to be using more of. So wood is the only large-scale construction material which is renewable, produced locally, and it's able to capture carbon dioxide. Obviously, it takes in carbon dioxide. It's one of the biggest benefits to building with timber is that it sequesters this large amount of carbon from the atmosphere and stores it within a building for as long as the building stands. Currently, construction with wood has its limitations, of course. This is cross-laminate timber. And so, for example, the biggest building whose frame is made out of wood is 18 stories, a building in Norway. And the biggest one made out of construction and steel is 160 odd stories. So, you know, we've got a long way to go in the wood construction. But cross-laminated timber is being used more and more in construction. This is the Maggie Center by a British company called DRMM, a firm of architects. Maggie Centers are cancer care centres, usually attached to a hospital. This is the one in Oldham in England. Most of its material is cross-laminated timber, in this case in tulip wood. It does have some steel holding up this floating ground floor, first floor rather, and it does have some steel around the window as well. But the main construction of it is in cross-laminated timber. So much so that the interior faces are also sometimes cross-laminated timber, exposed. All of the kitchen, all the table are made out of wood, and as is the kind of, you know, the worktop and the interior finishes. So I think what's promising is that whilst wood buildings were often received as, you know, cabin single-story things and not very interesting, here is suddenly an architecture practice taking this on and making kind of what is quite a marvelous building using predominantly wood. And I have to say DRMM are one of at the forefront of construction with wood. If you want to check out their website, you know, there's a lot more about sustainability practice on there. Okay.
So may I ask a question? Sorry,
Oh.
just I raised my hand before. I'm going to use the example of our building in the campus, Hatchcroft, which from day one when they built it, it had this kind of a wooden panel outside, which whenever I see it, I'm thinking sustainability, because, you know, like with our climate and rain and wood and water do not, you know, like, so you've seen the state of it from something looking really fantastic on day one. Yeah. After only a few months, it looks like rotten away. And I know people will say that that's age and adding character, but eventually I don't know whether it's a, you know, like whether there are certain limitations in terms of how to use wood.
It's a good point. I mean, I mean, I'm afraid I'm not massively familiar with Hatchcroft building, but often wood is used as a cladding material only. So it's a concrete building. Reinforced concrete building, and then the rain screen, the thing that keeps the first level of rain off, is timber. So there's lots of that. That became a fashion to do that, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about buildings that are constructed from timber in the first place, and with better detailing as to how that is constructed, it can continue to look really good. It does require some maintenance. You're right, George. I mean,
it's good to clarify. Good to clarify for people who, you know, like, because, you know, like, just to have it also on the record for the webinar. Good. Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
Okay. All right. So promoting biodiversity. Now, one of the things about making buildings is that it obviously takes land away. So sometimes we build in green belts, sometimes we build in industrial sites, but the natural habitats of many creatures and plants are being taken away because of that. So this is the vertical forest in Milan, 2014 building by Stefano Berio Architecture. it's certainly dramatic. It uses hundreds of trees, thousands of shrubs to effectively make a facade to the building, a living facade to the building. It's quite remarkable, and it's quite eye-catching. And there are benefits to this. So they've worked out that the vertical greenery that they have makes about 2,000 square meters if it was laid out on the floor of forest. It's kind of the equivalent. So by going vertical, we are getting far more kind of oxygen released into the environment, and it has this facade has extra benefits to the inhabitants apart from looking nice, in that it keeps the building cool. It regulates the humidity within the building. It produces oxygen, obviously. The trees produce oxygen. It absorbs microparticles from the atmosphere, from traffic pollution, that sort of thing. And it forms a habitat for birds and bees. So I think it's a really interesting solution. When we look a bit more closely, of course, the building itself is a regular building. It's a concrete structure building. It's just that this is then put onto the outside of it. So it goes a step, but maybe not too far. One thing I will say for it is that because it's vertical, it's a very dense vertical building, a tower block. It leaves the land free for other use. So again, for parks and for other greenery on the ground. It gets a lot of flats in a very small footprint. So that's another part of biodiversity. Another example of this, which you may know, is the High Line in New York by Scafido. This is an abandoned, it's a great example of both biodiversity and adaptive reuse. It's an abandoned railway line. Trains didn't run this line anymore. And rather than demolish the railway line, they've made a linear park out of it. So they've planted it out with trees and shrubs and made it a pedestrian walkway. So this little linear slip right through the city of a park that wasn't there before, which allows kind of relaxation spaces like the greenery here and grass, while still reminding us in certain parts about what its former use was. It kind of connects down to various streets and makes this little kind of this walkway at high level through the city. I think it's a really good example. All right, so penultimate kind of discussion topic is promoting debate. Hope we're not going off too long. So one of the things that architects and designers are very good at is being very secretive about what they're doing, about keeping ideas to themselves. And that's sort of had a little change recently with Architects Declare. They have a website, and they signed, a very famous architect signed a petition to the government, and they formed a website about climate and biodiversity emergency. And in this document, letter, and series of webinars and various things that they've put together, they've come across various things that some of which we've covered in this talk, about retrofitting wasteful buildings, energy wasteful buildings and unhealthy buildings with insulation to make them more healthy. The new buildings, if they have to be built, should be built to very stringent and measurable environmental standards, far stricter than we currently have. The materials that benefit public health and welfare and benefit the environment should be more to the fore than they currently are. And that more jobs are created within sustainable construction. It is potentially a massive growth field for industry in all countries. So another little thing that they talked about was that currently the VAT for a refurbishment project is the same as a new build project. And they want to shift that. They want to make it so that VAT on refurbishment is less, value-added tax. VAT on refurbishment is less on refurbished buildings than it is on new build buildings. So to cut it and to increase the VAT on new build. Right, this is a project that I've done in this same field about conversation and debate, promoting debate. This is High Tide. I entered an exhibition through the Building Centre and the Timber Trade Federation, and my entry was selected for six winners, which are now being exhibited at the Building Centre in central London until very early September, sometime, the 3rd of September. my project the project was to promote conversation about climate change. And what I proposed was a column that sits by the river, in our case in London, which shows the high tide, which is the 7.5 current high tide of the Thames, and 7.83, which is the predicted high tide. So NASA last year gave a report that's saying that sea levels are rising by 3.3 millimeters every year. And while 3.3 millimeters doesn't sound a lot, in 100 years, that will have a massive impact on approximately, they estimate, 600 million people worldwide. You've only got to think about how many people live next to a river in a city or on a coastal town to understand the impact that that will have. So the idea is that you see the column, you see the data, you see the word high tide, and you start to think, well, hang on, if that's the high tide in 100 years' time, I'm going to get my feet wet. But then also you start to think, well, what's the implication to the rest of the city around me? Oh, you know, the ground lowers there, so will that be flooded? So it starts to kind of promote a conversation about climate change. This is, as I said, this one is in London, London Bridge, because London Bridge in London is one of the datas for high tide. But they could be positioned in different places around the world, really. But there's some talk about this going to COP26 in Glasgow in November, this exhibition. Now, as part of that, we built one. We built a column, and there's some talk about that being cited on the Thames, which I'm still to hear about. But I thought an interesting thing, a kind of strange thing, is that this piece of wood is teak, and it came from Ghana. So I would think that's not particularly sustainable. But the Timber Trade Federation are trying to promote a thing called FLEDGED, which is the Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Action Plan, not a bit of a mouthful, which is to keep to stop deforestation around the world, to hand over to agriculture. So to try and keep forests as forests, and to do that, we have to provide support to the communities that are supporting that are keeping the forests there. So timber production under sustainable forest management practice is one of the best ways to keep trees and habitats standing. But we need to provide viable incomes for the communities around the world to keep those ecosystems as they are. So I think it's a really interesting debate that I would have thought this should be just a piece of timber from somewhere in the UK. But the fact that it's from Ghana, we are supporting the Forest Commission in Ghana. So this is FLEDGED, if you need to want to look that up. So finally, in this talk, the role of education. I'm sorry if this is going on for a little bit longer than I thought. So the role of education. So in interior design, we are already slightly greener than architecture. So as I said, I'm the module leader for the third year interior designer, because we're always working within a host building. But one of the things that we've introduced is that the students all have to write a sustainability report. It's a specification of materials, but they add in how their material may or may not be sustainable. And that naturally leads students to try and find materials that are more sustainable. So for example, in this example, we have concrete. And we know concrete's not sustainable, but the student has written that they founded a manufacturer of concrete that uses leftover concrete in the mix of the concrete. So that is slightly more green than before. And then a kind of more typical thing would be this Richlite material. Richlite is a sustainable material made from resin-infused paper and can be used as a surface material in many areas of architectural design. It's an alternative to a laminate countertop, kitchen countertop. Very good product. So we're switching on the students to the idea that sustainable practice is something that they're going to have to engage with, and it's something that clients are asking more and more about. This is a student called Millie, who's a graduate this year, Millie Frank, who's a graduate this year. And she did an agid project, really, a project that promotes debate and vigorous ideas about climate change research. So it's specifically, part of it is aimed for people who don't really believe in climate change, who kind of aren't a bit, kind of don't really agree with it. But some of the interesting things she did is use materials that will decay beautifully, so that will, as they get older, the patina of them will increase the value of the building, as well as combining that with new materials that are recycled. But also, she's used a very light touch in how the walls are done, how the building is constructed, so that the building is seen as an installation. The new thing is seen as an installation inside the host building and can be taken away and reused elsewhere afterwards. I think it's a really great project that she did. It's very light touch. Of course, it has a cafe, because who's going to go if it doesn't have a cafe? But right next to the cafe, it has a guest lecture sort of space where people can be invited to talk to members of the public as they're sitting having their coffee to talk about climate change. That was a really great project. All right, so to sum up, final thoughts. I think we need to think twice about demolishing existing buildings, and then rethink how we use the stock. If we can't not demolish the building, rethink about how we use the stock of the materials that are in it. Think about the buildings as material stores for the future. How can we harvest the materials? And I know that is more difficult, but I think that's what we have to do. And then also think ahead. So if you're designing a new building, can it be carbon zero, or can it be carbon negative? Can the building of it and the operation of it contribute to climate, to getting rid of CO2 emissions? We need design to be flexible. We need to think about the longevity of the building and how things can be added or taken away from a building. Can it be deconstructed? What are the various design iterations that might be in that space, one space? And I think the days of iconic, heavy, big, noticeable architecture, hopefully, are not on the rise, are starting to kind of to drift away a little bit. I think we should have less reliance on recycling. And I mean, whilst recycling is great, ultimately we have to use less to achieve more, minimizing waste rather than recycling it. And to integrate sustainability is a key part of whatever curriculum it is you're dealing with. I mean, we all use power, we all generate waste, but the current students will experience, as I have done, but they will experience even more radical change in the working lifetimes around sustainability practice. And we can't completely predict for the students what will happen, but we can introduce them to designing and studying for an improved environment. We can prepare students with critical questioning skills so they're challenging the way things are normally done. Okay, these are some references I've used in this talk. If anybody's interested in thinking about this further, I would really recommend this book, Everything Needs to Change, published by the Reba. It's very good. And if anybody has any questions, this is my email. Please feel free to email me. Okay, that's it.
Thank you so very much, Michael. This was really, really engaging, and I have to say that I have quite a lot of questions.
There's a lot of information in one go, I'm afraid, but there we are.
It is really impressive that, did you mention that you're going to be part of the COP26 exhibition?
Yeah, so that building centre exhibition, the Timber Trade Federation, who sponsored the exhibition, are looking to take that to COP26, as well as some other kind of exhibits. There's an online, you can walk around the exhibition online to see it. But I'm hopeful that that's going. They're still, I think, as everybody is waiting to see whether they've got places or not.
I know we're waiting as a project to be part of the British Council, so hopefully we can be there. Okay, so in terms of sustainability, do you see any trend? I mean, because like you mentioned the fact that you're a module leader of final year students, and actually these are the students who are ready to go to industry. And I believe in unless we persuade these people to have sustainability as one of their priorities, it's not going to happen. Mm. So, what are your views in terms of this generation and how much they think
they're definitely more switched on about sustainability than certainly I mean definitely it wasn't really a thing. I'm very old, so it wasn't really a thing when I was at college. It wasn't a thing at all, and I think it's coming to the fore. And I think that we hear it in the news quite regularly. That 50,000 buildings being demolished in the UK every year. That was in the national news on BBC News and around the world. That it's certainly something that even in the first year they are more switched on about than certainly we would ever be. And I think that we've embedded it into the curriculum in interior design. It inherently is part of the curriculum in interior design because we're working with an existing host building, as I was saying. But the looking for materials and thinking about how things are built in the first place is part of the curriculum, part of the learning. I think architecture schools need to wake up a little bit. You know, we are still kind of on this idea that, you know, the architect as, you know, building this massive, iconic, impressive building out of all new materials. You know, the kind of like, I mean, at the time of Frank Gehry making the Guggenheim in Bilbao is an amazing building, absolutely amazing. I've been several times. It's quite something. But yet it is all new materials. And when he was building that, he wouldn't be thinking about that. This wasn't part of the debate in that time. And so this kind of we need to be cleverer with our use of materials, and how buildings are built need to be clever. So that, you know, the building you have as your backdrop. This is an external space which is suddenly internal and therefore much more usable because of the roof. And the roof is quite a lightweight. And the one in the Grove building in Middlesex is an EFTE building roof structure. And that's a really good way to insulate a kind of atrium space. So there are kind of, you know, like even smaller scale things like the image you have behind you are thinking about how to use space in a more ecological, more useful way, rather than we could knock that building down and build a new building, but this is a better way of doing it, right?
Yeah, I mean, don't mention this building. I mean, I can see on that side used to be my first office. So when I was when I first arrived in here, there was terrible, the conversion into an office space. Two more questions, if you don't mind. Okay, one question comes from my own experience. I mean, I have a rental flat in Luton, and actually that was a conversion of an office block made into flats. And originally, I think that somebody thought that's a great idea because, you know, like they could not rent the office space. Just let's make some flats. So, yeah. Typical 1990s solution: plasterboard everywhere, no sound insulation, real heat insulation, and of course no central heating, which means everybody's using electric heaters. So, I guess there must be a shift towards sustainable and more a greener, if you like, conversion, right? So, I mean, all these conversions that happen in the 90s, and probably they are a climate bomb. So
absolutely, and that, you know, that's a conversion that's probably contributing negatively to, you know, to carbon emissions. Absolutely, and the current building regulations in the UK have improved. So after your, you know, in I think 2004, there's a big review. We had suddenly a thing called Part L, which improved all of the kind of thermal dynamic of any building that you're now building, or any conversion that you're now building. It just sets out minimal standards though, so it's not fabulous. But if they were doing that building now, if they were converting, which I think they will, I think there'll be more and more of, you know, lots of buildings in the 1980s and 90s were built with just huge glass facades, curtain walling. So, you know, glass is not particularly, you know, great insulating product. You know, it's great. It allows light through, but it's one of the weakest insulating products of any kind of building envelope. And so the how you convert is obviously key. You know, kind of the conversions which just go, okay, we're just going to put plasterboard partitions up and not put any sound insulation or not put any thermal insulation into the envelope of that are going to be flawed. You know, kind of they're not going to be successful. But that has changed, and so it would be unlikely that your conversion would happen in the same way now. And certainly, one thing about those, you know, terrible concrete buildings that I was bemoaning earlier in my talk is that their sound insulation in them between units will be amazing. You know, like that will be amazing, and the insulation on the outside will also be good. But the problem is that the way they're manufactured in the first place with concrete is the thing that's doing the harm to the environment. So it's kind of that, you know, it's a mixed message really in a way.
Final question, I promise, but I mean, you know, like you had an amazing talk, and actually, you know, like I'm pretty sure if it was end of July or September, we would have so many people asking thousands of questions. But again, that comes from my experience when I was a student in Manchester, and one of the imposing buildings in the skyline of Manchester was like these tower blocks in the Salford area. It's like from the 70s. Sorry, my connection has gone a little bit bad. So did you get that from the?
Yeah, got that. Yeah, Salford. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was reading about them as a student, and how initially the strategy was a lot of people in the same building, maybe some communal areas, creating a kind of a micro society, and then the communal areas started to becoming derelict, the place became less attractive to live in, and eventually it attracted their own kind of people and their own kind of activities. So now you see kind of this kind of concept blocks, and you're thinking this is definitely no-go area. Now, I don't know if we're going into circles, but I live in Watford, and one of the things that is happening now is like you see a lot of houses being demolished and being replaced by modern-looking, really amazing blocks of flats, which I think that it's every young professional's dream to live in there. But what's going to happen in 10, 15 years from now when the carpets get older, the elevator doesn't work as good as it used to be? And do you think that we're going to go into another crisis?
I mean, quite possibly. I mean, I think that it's quite fairly easy to blame the architects of the 1970s for some kind of fairly atrocious buildings, and at the time they were doing it with all moral conviction that this is the right way, this is the way forward. However, so there is in Sheffield there's a block of flats called Park Hill, which is kind of one of those case studies for regeneration in a kind of a positive way. It's a block of council flats that had a very bad reputation. Built in the 1970s, I think. I mean, I'm not a specialist on this, but a company called, I think, Urban Splash redeveloped them. And so I think it really depends on the skill of the developer and who they employ, kind of in that community, apparently, I mean, this is conjecture. I don't really truly know. Apparently that community is now, kind of, it's a desirable place to live again. So I think it is possible to do well. It just takes effort, so it's much easier to throw up a new building or to convert it badly. I think that the planning has gotten better at making communities that are sustainable in their longevity, so that kind of the stuff that's happening in Enfield in North London at the moment, where there's a huge housing building projects going on there, and in Tottenham as well. Part of that is what planners are trying to do is to make communities. So put in other buildings around it, like libraries and transport hubs and offices that are local, and shops that are local to that as well. Whereas I think before we were just kind of, there's a housing estate, and that it might have a little parade of shops and that's it. So you have to always leave it, or you're just stuck in that community. There's nothing to do in that community. So I mean, it's a very difficult question you're setting me there, George, and I don't know the answer overall. But it could be, couldn't it? It could be, of course. It could be that suddenly they're undesirable. But the quest to build taller, I think, is a correct one. And some of these buildings, some of these old disused, undesirable tower blocks are being retrofitted really well. And are becoming exemplars that are getting talked about in the architectural press as good practice. Clipping on balconies, for green space on the outside of existing structures, for example, is something that's kind of a big topic at the moment, to make them, kind of a nice spaces. We have a code now that means that you have to have some sort of outside amenity space to any building you're developing. So I see so many flats with balconies now, but some of them don't have that, and so that people are thinking about ways of improving the longevity of those buildings in that way.
It's been fantastic. Thank you so much for a really amazing presentation and answering all my questions. I think we just had somebody join in. Probably they got the timings wrong. So Karima, please type at least where you're from. You will see the recording soon, so we'll have the recording. Michael, thanks so much. Keep us posted how it goes with COP26, because if you are accepted, we could have an interview with you and all the universities, so it could be just a presentation, because in September and October, we will have the micro lesson. So we will have 5 live sessions with all the 14 universities.
Okay, great.
So it would be, especially if you have something really, like that you will be building on towards November, we will be more than happy to use our momentum to help.
Okay, well, we'll keep in touch, George. Okay, great.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for, again, it's been fantastic. It kept me really, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to be one of the most downloaded webinars that we will put on our YouTube. And
thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.